Michael Crichton wants you to believe that climate change isn't real. I discuss this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read from a familiar author, one that focuses on eco-terrorist and climate change. I am referring to State of Fear by Michael Crichton, which was published in 2004, one of the last two books that he got published while he was still alive. I've already talked about Michael Crichton on this channel before, so I don't need to go into that great a detail, but he wrote a number of books, mostly science fiction, but he also wrote more dramatic stories as well, and he was also a screenwriter. He wrote the Westworld movie that was made, and he also wrote Jurassic Park and then published it into a script as well that got made into the Jurassic Park movie. Very fascinating writer, but there have been a number of problems that I've noted with his work. Sometimes he overdoes it on the research. The dialogue can be kind of stuffy, kind of unrealistic at times, and numerous other problems that we'll talk about. And then after he died, his estate continued to publish books under his name, including Pirate Latitudes and Monster Teeth or something like that, or Dragon Teeth. And then more recently, there was a book called Eruption, which was published in collaboration with James Patterson, which doesn't feel like it fits Michael Crichton all that well. But that's where we're at. But without further ado, let's talk about State of Fear. I'll do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we can move on from there. So State of Fear primarily focuses on the character of Peter Evans. And it also, Peter Evans is a lawyer who is working with other individuals to kind of figure out what's going on with shady groups that are planning something sinister by purchasing large equipment, cavitation equipment that'll dig holes into the earth or something else like that. Basically, eco-terrorist groups. And Peter Evans is a lawyer for a man named George Morton, who is a wealthy philanthropist. He's funding a lawsuit on behalf of the people of Vanuatu in the Pacific. They are going to sue the United States, saying that climate change will disproportionately affect them, and the United States is the biggest producer of fossil fuels and carbon emissions and whatnot. But the lawyers for this lawsuit have their doubts about climate change and begin showing evidence that maybe climate change isn't actually real. And I should point out that Michael Crichton is using actual graphs that have been pulled from the research, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But as George begins learning more about this, he doesn't want to support NERF, which is a climate change foundation. And he is contacted by a man named Professor Kenner, who is telling him more about the leader of that foundation, a man named Nicholas Drake. And unfortunately, George Morton goes missing in an accident after announcing that he's pulling his funding from NERF in the future, and everyone kind of believes that he might be dead because he crashed near the ocean, and so Peter at this point is contacted by Professor Kenner, and as Kenner also reaches out to Sarah, who is George's secretary, and tries to get them involved in what he's trying to do. Professor Kenner seems to be an agent of the U.S. government and is hunting down eco-terrorists around the world who are planning something sinister. As I said before, they head to Antarctica. I don't know why you're bringing a lawyer along on this who has no skill in hunting terrorists, but they try to stop the terrorists from blowing off a huge chunk of the ice shelf, which they'll blame on climate change. They don't manage to stop it, but but Peter and Sarah get captured and like dumped into like a crevice, but they manage to get out and learn more about the terrorist in the process. They then head to the American Southwest. The terrorists plan more traps, including lightning-based traps that they manage to break out of, and the terrorists use rockets to create a storm that creates a flash flood in a deserty type of area where a bunch of families are having picnics, which were organized by a front for the terrorist organization that looked like a charity of some sort. But thanks to Peter and Sarah's work, they managed to stop some of the terrorists, and also they managed to warn people about the flash flood coming their way, so it's not as disastrous and not blamed on climate change there. At this point, Peter returns to LA. His law firm is yelling at him for seemingly going off and doing other things, and Nicholas seems to suspect that he might be working with Professor Kenner, and is actively trying to find out more about that, because Nicholas seems to be working with the eco-terrorist. We also find out that the case, the climate change case, is being secretly ended. There's a big PR push that says it's going to go on, but the lawyers have stopped doing work, and who knows what's going to happen with that in the future. Meanwhile, the authorities state that they found George's body, and Peter's asked to identify it, which he goes, and it in fact seems like it's George's body. And then when Peter gets back home, he's attacked by some of the terrorists who use a poisonous octopus to try to kill him. Luckily, the others show up and manage to stop that. And when Peter goes to another sort of press conference, he's kind of not attacked, but accosted, or like another professor kind of confronts him and talks about how we're all living in a state of fear, that there used to be a military-industrial complex, but now there's a political, legal, media-based complex that is spreading fear, and universities are largely responsible for it in order to get more funding, and they're putting out, lies and saying that climate change is real in order to keep the populace controlled, which there's a lot to talk about there. But we'll get to that. And then Kenner says that Sarah and another woman and Peter need to fly to the Solomon Islands for the last part of what the terrorists are planning. They seem to want to generate a tsunami that'll flood the California coast, and might be attributable to climate change again. They bring along an actor named Ted Bradley who believes in climate change, although Professor Kenner and everyone else are starting to have their doubts. But unfortunately, Ted Bradley is killed by cannibals on the Solomon Islands, which is kind of weird. But they do their best to try to stop the terrorist, and unfortunately, the undersea charges manage to detonate, but they detonate prematurely before the work is finished, so it's not able to harm the California coast or anywhere like that. But the waves do come crashing upon the Solomon Islands, which they're able to get to higher ground. It's at this point that we also learn that George Morton faked his death in order to drag out the terrorist and get Nicholas Drake into trouble. And as the story comes to a close, they seem to have won the day against these terrorists, kind of. But Morton notes that he has new conservation plans that'll focus on actually fixing the environment rather than focusing on something that might not be true, like climate change. In terms of analysis, there is a lot worth talking about with State of Fear. You're probably going to hear this from me a lot, but this story feels very much like conservative delusion, or conservative propaganda, which I don't really know where Michael Crichton's ideological priorities were 4 years before his death, but the man had a lot of money, and based on what else he had written, especially with books like Disclosure, I don't know, it does kind of feel like he was a conservative individual, and his other writings suggest a number of other weird aspects about himself, which I'll get to. But one of the more interesting elements of the story is the idea of control. So Crichton argues that many of the crises post-1990s were fabricated to generate fear. He argues that prior to the 1990s, the word crisis wasn't really used all that much, but I beg to differ. There were a number of very serious moments, especially even in the 1800s, where people said this is a big deal, we should be talking about this. There wasn't the news media that kind of amplified it even further, but there were very serious moments and very critical moments in American history and world history that kind of necessitated the use of the word crisis. But Crichton argues that, this is a new fad, that the news media, that universities are kind of drumming up fear in order to control the population and to also generate more potential wealth for themselves. He specifically notes that pertains to environmental movements, where he says that humanity, doesn't really have the power to control the environment all that much, that they're rather insignificant, but there's this big push to say, yes, in fact, there is some power in humans, and they are affecting the environment, and that is being done through these new standards that are being forced upon people by the EPA, which again, a very conservative thing to argue, but it's also being done through this terrorism by creating the illusion that all of this is happening through climate change. It's better to control the narrative, and then you can get funding, and you can get research for what you're hoping to get research for. Allow me to read you an interesting quote from this. That is what the evidence shows. Of course, now we have radical fundamentalism and post-9/11 terrorism to make us afraid. And those are certainly real reasons for fear, but that is not my point. My point is there is always a cause for fear. The cause may change over time, but the fear is always with us. Before terrorism, we feared the toxic environment. Before that, we had the communist menace. The point is, although the specific cause of our fear may change, we are never without the fear itself. Fear pervades society in all its aspects, perpetually, which is an interesting quote. And there is certainly an argument to be made for that. Like this fear is holding society back, and it actually benefits a number of people at the top for you to fear that. But what's interesting is that Michael Crichton says all of that, and then he's like, actually, the universities are the problem. They tell you what words you can or cannot say. They are funding all of this research. They are generating huge amounts of evidence to suggest that this is the problem. They're creating the fear. But the question is, are universities a problem? Sure, they do fund this research, and they study important topics or various topics like that, but they are given funding by the United States to do this kind of research. The government wants to know the answers to these questions, which is very important. But I will argue that there is a sense of control, a sense of spreading fear, especially that happened after 9/11, when the government wanted you to believe that more strikes were on the way, when the government wanted you to believe that noxious gas might be, thrown at us by more terrorists. And that continues even under the Trump administration. It continued under Obama. They wanted you to be afraid so that they can get more funding for the military and for other things. So Crichton is doing interesting things. Like he's doing the math, but he's coming to the wrong answer ultimately. Because yes, there is a sense of control and a sense of fear in this world, in the United States' culture, but he's pointing the fingers at the university and saying they're the problem. He's kind of being a weird progenitor of cancel culture, or saying that cancer culture exists. But I think in arguing that it's the university's fault, he's really just helping the people who are actually causing the problems. Because if we're too busy, fighting with the universities or fighting other members of the human race, we're not really focusing on the people who are picking our pockets, or focusing on the people who are benefiting from spreading this fear. Companies like Palantir and other groups that help do surveillance and things like that. So Crichton's right, but he's also hugely wrong in this story. Another major element of this story, perhaps the entire crux of this story is that of climate change, but here it's climate change denial. The entire book is about climate skepticism. Michael Crichton presents a number of charts and graphs. He practically stops the plot of the story to give you charts and graphs that amplify the point he is trying to make, which is that climate change is not real, that scientists are wrong, or they're actively lying to you in order to get more funding for their research. And when other characters say, well, hey, those graphs could have been funded by the oil industry, which they most definitely were, another character says, well, we're all being paid by someone, which is a very stupid thing to say, because yes, like, we're being paid by universities, we're being paid by, philanthropists sometimes, but the oil industries have a vested interest to keep us in buying oil. Those other philanthropists, they might be trying to fund research, but they're not being paid off by the oil or gas industries, or the solar power industries, or the wind power industries. We're all in the pocket of someone, but sometimes being in the pocket of someone doesn't necessarily mean you're going to lie all the time. In order to get more of that funding. That seems like a real weird kind of argument to make there. And Michael Crichton is also arguing that human beings are not significant enough to cause climate change. And he cites multiple instances throughout history or prehistory to kind of make his point. But that doesn't change the fact that ever since the late 1800s, because of our increased use of fossil fuels and because of the increased amount of carbon emissions, there's a correlation there. And correlation doesn't equal causation, but it's hard to not ignore the coincidence that's taking place there. And ultimately, I would argue Michael Crichton is wrong. He presents this in the story trying to make a very clear point, but he's doing a number of things wrong. One, he's misinterpreting the research. He's a medical doctor. He's not a climate change research person, so I wouldn't trust his word. He's also misrepresenting the research. Multiple scientists came out after this book was published and said, hey, you misused my research to make a point that nobody was trying to make. It's easy to take graphs out of context and say there must not be climate change because this graph says there's not. But if you don't know the full context, you're kind of lying to people, or you're just spreading ignorance entirely. So Michael Crichton's point in this entire story that climate change isn't real isn't based in any actual fact. It's misleading, and it's minimizing the power of climate change and the need for action. Because if you don't do something, you're going to see more forest fires, which is what's happening 20 years after he wrote this. We're seeing major weather events produced by climate change. 20 years after he wrote this, we're seeing a lot of very bad things happening that could possibly devastate humanity and create life more difficult for people. But something also that stands out to me is something he does in this story. He argues that it's not a crisis, that it's not a big deal, and that throughout history there have been moments where people have shouted about these kinds of things when they're actually not that significant. Because he says, oh, you remember Africanized bees or Y2K. People were talking about that all the time, and then nothing ever came about it, which feels really weird for someone who does a lot of research to just blankly say that, because those were a big deal. But then the researchers, the scientists, the experts went out and made sure that it wasn't a problem. Scientists, beekeepers made sure to prevent Africanized bees from becoming a major threat. They intervened. With Y2K, computer scientists intervened and fought to make sure that whatever Y2K bug there might have been, it wasn't going to have an impact, or its impact would be minimized. And that's happened in many other cases. There were those weird hornet bees that were going to cause a problem around 2019 most recently, and people worked to make sure that they weren't going to cause any problems. And that's been the case for many other instances as well. And so it's very weird that Michael Crichton would say, oh, it's not a crisis, and not bother to point out that people actually intervened and tried to fix the problem. They worked up to the last minute in many cases. And if you say, well, nothing ever became of that, you're lying to people. You're misrepresenting the truth. So Michael Crichton is either purposely lying or he's ignorant, and ignorance is no excuse there. But even greater than that, this all just feels like a conservative delusion. conservative propaganda, that climate change isn't that real, and that universities are actually the problem, because they control what we can or cannot say. And ultimately, even larger than that, this all feels like this is just a bunch of gripes that Michael Crichton has against liberals, against ecologists, against people who care about the environment. Like, someone told him that he was wrong about something, so he was like, I'll show you, I'm going to write an entire book about where you're the villain of the story. And he does seem like that kind of petty person, because he's done that even in the book Next, even in other books. Like, he wrote in characters who were named after critics and were the villains of the story. So it is very important to talk about this, because when you present this type of story and say that climate change isn't that big of a deal, like, someone's going to read this and accept that as fact, when that's just not the case. It's every bit as ignorant as the things that Ayn Rand was writing in Atlas Shrugged and presumably The Fountainhead. What an idiot, I have to say. And there are interesting elements of the story, but it's undermined by a lot of Crichton's worst impulses, because in his books he has a lot of things that he consistently does, which isn't necessarily a problem if the story is written well. Like, for example, here you see smug characters who feel that they're right. Smug writing where Crichton wants to say, well, look at me, I did my research. Look at all these other people who look like clowns now. Bad dialogue where it doesn't feel like characters are talking in a way that human beings actually talk. And science taken out of context. It's all things that kind of drag down each Michael Crichton book. But if written pretty well, you can kind of ignore that at times. That happens in Jurassic Park, where Ian Malcolm doesn't talk like a human being at all. But because the story is so fascinating, I think it adds a little bit of charm to the entire thing. And because the story sucks so goddamn much, it's hard to not ignore. It's hard to not make this feel like immense suffering, like a slog to get through. Also, why bring a lawyer along for this story? That doesn't make any sense to me. The lawyer has no power or skills or training to do anything real, and it feels like that's pretty much the entire story, where none of the characters have real agency. Things just kind of happen. If you hadn't taken Peter along, not much really would have changed, so it just feels pretty weird. And then the last thing I want to note is that Michael Crichton should really pick a lane here. He's writing two different stories. One is a nonfiction book about how climate change isn't real, and the other one is a fictional story about eco-terrorists trying to bring attention to a problem by doing terrorism. And I feel like he should have picked one or the other. He could have written a book about how climate change wasn't real and been very much wrong about it and had a bunch of scientists tell him that he was wrong about it. Or he could have written a pretty interesting book about bringing attention to a global problem through terrorism and the problems that it might create. And he does none of that. He tries to do both, and it weakens both of those types of stories. Part of me is kind of cynical and thinks, well, maybe he did that so that he could say, well, I'm just trying to raise awareness of all of this. I'm trying to call attention to how some people are skeptical of climate change. And besides, this story is fictional, so don't harass me about it. But again, the cynical part of me is thinking he's trying to shield any criticism by doing that. But I don't have proof of that. I just know that this is not working out for him. Anyway, those are my thoughts on State of Fear by Michael Crichton. A very bad story. Not at all good. It feels really weird to read, and 20 years later, none of it holds up, because climate change has grown even worse at this point, continues to grow worse every day, is leading to heat waves, is leading to cold snaps and severe winter weather events, leading to stronger hurricanes, stronger storms, bigger problems, and it's very clear that if we don't do something bad will happen to humanity at large. And for Michael Crichton to be like, oh, well, none of this is a problem, it really shows how fucking wrong he was this entire time and how embarrassing this type of story is years later. So don't seek this out. I should also point out that this kind of spurred something in me where I was 100 pages in and I was like, I'm not having fun with this. And also it was when Trump was kind of amplifying things with Iran, and I was like, we could die in nuclear fire at any point. Why am I still reading this? Do I really want this to be the last thing I read before I die? And, you know, given all that's happening in the world, I think that's a mindset I need to adopt, where, like, it's okay to not finish books if you're not enjoying it. I usually feel like that's, you know, not the way to go, but I think I'm going to start moving in that direction because of this book specifically. So I think in the future I might just, you know, highlight specific books that I didn't finish and why, and maybe what I would have done differently than the author in order to make it more exciting and something that should be finished in the future. I don't know. But that's probably the direction that I'll head, and you can thank Michael Crichton for that. That said, I do still want to read more Michael Crichton in the future because any book is bound to be better than this one. But we'll see about that. So yeah, if you have any thoughts on this, let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear from you, especially if you think this sucks or if you think I'm wrong and this is actually a really great book. But if you think that climate change isn't real, you're an idiot as well. Yeah, otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that other people can find out about this book or this author if they don't already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and climate change related travels. Farewell.